Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Grand Admiral Thrawn was easily one of the most capable military officers to ever serve in the Galactic Empire. Even amongst his own people, the Chiss, Thrawn was considered a savant. His analytical capabilities were unmatched and helped him accurately predict his enemy's tactical movements and strategies. When Thrawn was exiled, he arrived in Imperial space only armed with his wits. His mission was to assess the Empire and see if it was a threat to his people or potentially an ally against the many threats that the Chiss faced in the chaotic unknown region. Thrawn was so impressive in their initial meeting that the Emperor gave him an opportunity to attend an Imperial military academy. This led to Thrawn's first posting in the Empire as a lieutenant and the second weapons officer on a Gazanti-class cruiser known as the Blood Crow. This was just a few years after the rise of the Empire. Roughly 15 years later, Thrawn was no longer a lieutenant. He had risen to the highest rank within the Imperial Navy and was promoted to the rank of Grand Admiral by Palpatine himself. Shortly after that, he was given responsibility over the mighty 7th Fleet. Now, throughout Thrawn's military career, he was always this outside-the-box type of thinker. Whether he was a junior officer or the commander of a fleet, Thrawn always brought with him a very creative approach to warfare. In today's video, we're going to take a closer look at his 7th Fleet and what kind of firepower Thrawn actually had at his disposal. The Imperial Navy was a massive entity, the largest branch of the Galactic Empire's sprawling military force. And that's because the Empire's territory was 99.99999% outer space. Now, many different factions had different mentalities on how to approach guarding and securing all of this space. The Imperial military's view was building a massive military-industrial complex that could also support a massive military. It was said that at the height of the Imperial military strength, the Navy had over 25,000 Imperial-class Star Destroyers available for deployment. Now, the Empire was technically an autocracy with Emperor Palpatine at the head, but because of the sheer size of the galaxy, you actually had this large bureaucratic layer that was in between Emperor Palpatine and then, the troops on the ground. Emperor Palpatine was officially the head of the Imperial military and also the Imperial Navy, but for more day-to-day tasks, he had the Joint Chiefs of the Galactic Empire to help operate the military. These individuals were selected from various branches of the military. The Joint Chiefs were essentially an advisory board that would brief the Imperial High Command, which was led by a Supreme Commander of all Imperial military forces. And then beneath the Supreme Commander within the Imperial High Command was the Admiralty, who was in charge of administrating the Imperial Navy. This includes coordinating campaigns as well as shaping Imperial naval doctrine and acquiring ships and materials. Now, mind you, all of these individuals also had to directly report to Palpatine as well. I'm really surprised that Emperor Palpatine wasn't killed by the overwhelming amount of bureaucracy he had to deal with. Now, Grand Admiral Thrawn was at a rank where he could have been invited to sit on the Admiralty board himself. Unfortunately, there was a lot of controversy about having an alien rank so high in the Imperial Navy. Some of the more stubborn and xenophobic military leaders would have had some serious issues working alongside Thrawn, and Emperor Palpatine had to balance these things out a little bit. And so even though Thrawn enjoyed political protection from the Emperor himself, it's probably good that Thrawn was never placed on the Admiralty board. Because he also clearly had some big problems with Imperial Navy doctrine, and some of that was because of his Chiss culture and upbringing, and some of that was just because he had more common sense than the Imperial board did. Thrawn would also become a huge critic for the Death Star program. He lobbied instead for more funding for his own advanced fighter concept known as the Defender. But more on that later. Thrawn would be given the 7th Fleet and sent out to the Lothal sector. His job would be to pacify the local rebel movement that was growing there. Because Imperial doctrine heavily favored the use of battleships, an Imperial fleet was usually built around at least half a dozen ships of the line like the Imperial-class Star Destroyer. Now, most sectors in the galaxy had their own sector fleet depending on how large and important that sector was and how many dangers were basically threatening it. The Lothal sector fleet, for instance, was about average in size for the Empire, but pretty large for an Outer Rim-based unit. At its core, the Lothal sector fleet had 6 Imperial-class Star Destroyers, along with several smaller support vessels like the Arcanum-class cruiser. They also had a ground-based contingent of TIE fighters. Lothal was a pretty mineral-rich sector, and so the fleet there was mostly assigned to anti-smuggling and anti-piracy operations. Then you had the Noat Sector Fleet, which was centered around 8 Star Destroyers. This system included like Hoth, Bespin, and Burnin Khan, so it was even more important in a lot of ways for the Empire's overall strategy. Then you had the Endor Sector Fleet, which was just massive because of course you're guarding the second Death Star. Then you had the numbered fleets, which included Admiral Thrawn's 7th Fleet. These were mobile fleets which were far less in number. They were sort of like a quick reaction force or expeditionary force designed to either reinforce Imperial systems that were getting overrun or carry out offensive operations on their own. Because of the more dangerous and demanding nature of these type of actions, you usually had an admiral that was a lot more capable put in charge of these mobile fleets, individuals like Grand Admiral Thrawn. Now, Grand Admiral Thrawn would actually take over the 7th Fleet from Admiral Sartan. We don't really know much about him, but apparently he loses his job to the Chiss. This would happen shortly after Thrawn's victory at Bataan. So Thrawn's 7th Fleet was really massive. It was not a normal mobile fleet. In the Rebel series, when we see the 7th Fleet in operation, we usually see only smaller detachments like a squadron or task force of ISDs. Now, because Palpatine really liked Thrawn and basically saw him as a problem solver, his 7th Fleet was a mobile fleet but on steroids. Generally speaking, mobile fleets are going to feature the most modern and heavily armed vessels in the Navy. These are essentially vanguard units. But the 7th was one of the largest mobile fleets in the Imperial Navy. It had 9 Imperial 1 class Star Destroyers and an additional 16 Imperial class 2 Star Destroyers as well. This included Thrawn's own personal ship, the Chimera, a class 1 ISD. Once Thrawn reached the rank of Commodore, he was gifted this ship, as was common for the more talented officers within the Imperial Navy. For continuity and familiarity reasons, the Chimera would actually follow Thrawn throughout the rest of his career and serve as his command ship. Now, the only major difference between a Class 1 and Class 2 Imperial class Star Destroyer is that the latter version has a comms tower in between the 2 bridge deflector shield generators instead of a tractor beam assembly. Now, at 1.6 kilometers or 1 mile in length, these behemoths were massive floating cities armed to the teeth with weapons emplacements. The ISD was actually at the heart of the Imperial naval doctrine. The ISD was first and foremost a battleship, which means it used its 68 turbo laser batteries and 60 ion cannon emplacements to blast the enemy into submission. Exchanging broadsides at line-of-sight ranges might seem a bit antiquated for space battles, but this was the Empire's policy. Now, Thrawn clearly was not interested in massing his fleet in large parade formations and exchanging fire in this way with his enemies. As a Chiss commander, he was more used to fighting numerically superior enemies, and he was oftentimes outgunned. Thrawn was actually very used to outmaneuvering his enemies and using subterfuge. Now, ISDs weren't just weapons platforms, though. They were usually equipped with an entire legion of stormtroopers, along with their motor pool, heavy weapons, and transport vessels. These Star Destroyers could also deploy around a wing of starfighters, usually separated into 3 squadrons. A bit disappointing for a ship of this size, but most of the starfighters were the basic TIE variant that were only useful for short-range interception. These starfighters were supposed to bolster the relatively weak point defense systems on board of these battleships. And so really, if you take a look at Imperial naval doctrine, the ISDs were kind of like these self-contained tactical assault groups. The destroyer itself could serve as a forward operations base, which could stay in orbit if, say, the enemy's anti-air defenses are still intact. Everything an offensive operation could need, including shuttles, heavy armor, reconnaissance, and of course infantry, could be deployed from an ISD and also housed there. And on top of that, you also had the terrifyingly powerful and accurate fire support from the Star Destroyer itself. On top of that, an ISD was usually deployed with a wide range of support vessels. Like a carrier group, the ISDs themselves were quite vulnerable to enemy fighters and long-range guided munitions, like the ones the Separatists used to use. The 7th Fleet had at least, if not more, 12 Archidans-class command cruisers. These were 230-meter-long light cruisers that dated back from the Republic era. They filled a variety of different roles, from commanding smaller patrol units to even serving as a specialized communications vessel for the larger fleets. The Archidans class was far more powerful than any Rebel Carillion-style corvette like the CR-90 or the Hammerhead. The 7th Fleet also had at least 9 Gazanti-class cruisers. These were essentially civilian freighters that were outfitted for patrol duty as a cost-efficient replacement for the Archidans class. The Gazanti-class cruiser was able to lift heavier weapons like AT-ATs into battle, which was actually quite convenient at a tactical level. Thrawn also had access to 4 Dreadnought-class heavy cruisers. These were pre-Clone Wars era capital ships, which were extremely durable and well armed for the time. They most likely had to undergo some kind of modernization program to stay up to date with Imperial protocol. And lastly, Thrawn had access to 2 Interdictor-class Star Destroyers. These were technically heavy cruisers at around 1,129 meters in length. They were only armed with 20 quad laser cannons and a single squadron of TIE fighters. Most of the resources and energy on the ship were redirected to its 4 gravity well projectors, which were able to prevent ships from jumping into hyperspace and at the same time pull them out of hyperspace. The Chiss actually had access to this type of technology, and so Thrawn was very familiar with using gravity wells to bottleneck and trap enemy fleets, a perfect counter to the rebels who oftentimes try to run away into hyperspace when facing the Imperial Navy's numerical advantage. Thrawn would also use the 7th Fleet as a testing bed for his own TIE Defender line of advanced starfighters. These starfighters were equipped with almost every feature you could want in a TIE fighter. This included shields, a hyperdrive, more laser cannons, more armor, and of course a munitions launcher. But ultimately, these TIE fighters cost 5 times more than a standard TIE. Admiral Thrawn's Chiss mentality of quality over quantity just did not fit into the larger Imperial naval doctrine for starfighters. Now, when Thrawn arrived to the Lothal sector, he was also given control of the Lothal sector fleet, which was under the command of Cassius Constantine. Admiral Cassius Constantine was relatively incompetent. Sector fleet commanders were usually less capable than Mobil fleet commanders, and that was because they're mostly in charge of security or defensive operations. Many of these individuals also became quite corrupt because of their natural authority over their host systems. These fleet commanders were also responsible for logistics, and so they needed to create contracts with local suppliers to fuel and maintain their fleets. And so taking bribes and gifts from suppliers was very common. So Admiral Thrawn's Mobil fleet was around 3 to 4 times the size of your average Imperial naval fleet. This just shows you how much trust Palpatine had in Thrawn and how much damage those freaking space whales did to the Imperial Navy. Well guys, let me know in the comment section below what you think about Admiral Thrawn's fleet. Was it too large for the Chiss to control or not? Also guys, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan and my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy.